Welcome. Is it Coney? It comes up as Coney M.
Magnus.
Magnus.
Yep.
Okay.
Hi.
Sorry.
That's all right. My name is backwards.
Cool. Awesome.
Okay.
And then
Yeah.
do you want to start, Sinwang?
Yes. Right. Can you see my screen just to make sure?
Yeah, you need to just start your presentation.
Is that working now?
No, we still see the PowerPoint program, not the presentation. There we go. That's it.
Okay,
you got
perfect.
it.
All right, so welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, to our virtual book launch of the book Innovation in Learning Oriented Language Assessment. My name is Chong. I'm one of the editors of the book, and together with me it's Professor Hayo Reinders, who most of you, I think all of you know. So we're here to kind of basically celebrate this accomplishment together with some of our contributors, and most importantly to share with you what the book is all about and some of the topics that we find quite excited about in terms of language assessment, in particular learning oriented assessment. So before we start, we have a whole program ahead of us, but before we start and get too excited, how do you want to say a few words to the people here?
No, I just really want to echo what you said, Sinwang. I mean, this is really a celebration, mostly of the work that all the contributors have done to this book. All we did really was the organization, but the actual hard work and the actual content and the actual meaningful input is all from the authors, and we're really grateful because it's been actually very plain sailing, hasn't it, Sinwang, with the contributors? I mean, everybody's been very good to work with, and yeah, I think I'm very happy with the result. I hope everybody else is as well, because it's a very nice and really quite comprehensive collection, as we'll talk about in a moment. So yeah, I just also want to give a shout out to Sinwang. He's done by far the majority of the work. Yeah, he's always a great colleague and a great person to work with. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. But yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. We are recording, as you will have noticed. Obviously, there's people in certain parts of the world who can't join us at the moment, so we'll put this on YouTube later. If you don't want to be seen on YouTube, you can just leave your camera off. But that'll help to make it available to others. But yeah, thanks everybody for showing up, for joining us here, or viewing the video at a later point.
Thanks, Hayo. As I said, we have a very packed program ahead of us. But first, I just want to acknowledge the contributions of all the authors. We have altogether 18 chapters in the book representing innovative practices of learning-oriented language assessment across the world. So we have contributions from China, from Brazil, from Turkey, Norway, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and Spain. So we're quite proud of this.
And New Zealand.
And New Zealand. How you're everywhere. So I'll just put like below. Yeah. So yeah, and New Zealand, of course. So we kind of represent the whole spectrum of practices in different educational contexts. And I think this is precisely what the contribution of the book is all about. Because if you're familiar with the notion of learning-oriented assessment or learning-oriented language assessment, it has been there for quite a while. So for example, David Carlis wrote his paper on learning-oriented assessment in 2007 for higher education audience. And if you are familiar with the work by Jim Purpura, for example, in his book Assessing Grammar in 2004, he first talked about learning-oriented assessment for grammar. And obviously, Jim has been working on this topic with a number of colleagues, most notably Caroline Turner, on developing a framework for learning-oriented language assessment. So there has been a lot of work, a lot of excellent work conceptually. But I think what I'm not seeing is what learning-oriented language assessment may look like in practice. And so I think this is what our book can contribute to the whole discussion and the whole discourse. So I'm really excited about it. So this is the rundown for today's program. We'll try to keep our parts short and then let other people talk more. So we would like to basically explore what learning-oriented language assessment means to different people. So when you sign up for the event, there was an item asking you, what does LOLA mean to you? And I'm going to show you the results in just a minute. And then I have, we have a little bit of surprise for audience here, that we have invited 2 experts, really experts in this area, to record a short message about what they think learning-oriented language assessment is all about, especially in a post-COVID and ChatGPT generative AI era. And then we will share a little bit about what we as editors understand LOLA, looking at the chapters. And then I'm very happy to have 3 colleagues, 3 contributors who are going to share their chapters as case studies, and then we'll hopefully have some time for open discussion. All right, so that's the rundown for today. So this is the result. So I have had, so we had around 40 people registered, and a number of them kind of reply to this question: what does learning-oriented language assessment mean to you? And you can see some really interesting keywords popping up. And of course, the word assessment and learning, it's there. That's not surprising. But if you see words like learners and student centers, so to some people, this kind of assessment means we're really thinking about the needs of the learners, the proficiency level of the learners. Feedback is another key word there. Feedback is a word that's always featured, or mechanism that's always featured in formative assessment, that's also featured in LOLA. You can see something like testing, test. So it's very interesting to then talk about how tests can be learning oriented as well later. And then there are also some verbs that I find quite interesting. For example, facilitate. So how learning can, how assessment can facilitate learning, how assessment can help learners to learn better. So there are all these interesting keywords here that we can come back to in our open discussion. But these are really interesting ideas to get us started. Now, this is the part, one of the parts that I get very excited about, because I was able to reach out to Jim Papura and Professor Jim Papura and Professor David Carlis, and asked them whether they would like to record a short message for our launch event, because as you all know, that they are kind of the gurus in this topic, really. David Carlos mostly in higher education, Jim Papura in language testing and assessment. So they are busy people, but they have agreed to record a short message to us about what they think LOLA means now. So it will be very interesting to hear what they think. So first, let me just stop sharing, and I have to share again. Let me just start with David Carlos's message. Share sound. Can you see the video? Yeah. Okay, cool. And let me know if you cannot hear the sound.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to congratulate the editors in Wang, Chong and Hayo Reinders for their edited collection, Innovations in Learning-Oriented Language Assessment. I'm David Carlis from the University of Hong Kong, and I'd just like to say a few words about learning-oriented assessment. In 2002, through a large amount of fortune and a little bit of skill, I was awarded a large grant to research classroom assessment in higher education. And my project manager, after a few months, said to me, we need to establish an identity for the project. And we sat down over a cup of coffee and we brainstormed the term learning-oriented assessment to emphasize the development of student learning as being a top priority in assessment. Then in the coming months, we tried to conceptualize learning-oriented assessment in the form of a tripartite framework involving assessment tasks as learning tasks, evaluative expertise to encompass things like peer assessment and self-assessment, and thirdly, effective feedback principles, feedback for uptake, as it were. And through this framework, we wanted to synergize good summative assessment, however defined, with formative assessment. And we wanted to make the point that learning-oriented assessment could encompass all forms of assessment if they had a priority of developing student learning, difficult though that may be. And then a year or so later, one of my team members said to me, we need a paper for us to cite. So, David, can you write a paper on learning-oriented assessment? I tried to do this, and it came out in 2007 in the journal Innovations in Education and Teaching International, Learning-Oriented Assessment, Conceptual Basis and Practical Implications. I then left the concept for a while, came back to it in 2015, wrote another slightly better paper that came out in Higher Education. And learning-oriented assessment was the framework for my 2015 book, Excellence in University Assessment. Shifting to learning-oriented language assessment, or LOLA, which is a nicer acronym than LOPE, I think the crossover to applied linguistics may have come through the brilliant Liz Hamp-Lyons, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, because she was familiar with our project in Hong Kong, but was also active in North America and internationally. Or possibly Jim Purpura and colleagues in the States may well have developed learning-oriented assessment, learning-oriented language assessment independently of our work in Hong Kong. I really don't know. So focusing for a minute on the current edited collection, I should emphasize that most of my work in the last few years has been on feedback. I haven't really followed all the developments of learning-oriented language assessment, but I do particularly like the principle in the introduction to the edited collection, Principle 8. The learning aspect of summative assessment can be maximized when it is designed, implemented, and followed up appropriately. And I would argue it's followed up appropriately when student learning is seen as being the top priority of an assessment process. So finally, what does learning-oriented language assessment or learning-oriented assessment in higher education mean for the ChatGPT era? And I'm getting an optimistic feeling that the framework still holds. Assessment tasks as learning tasks. Well, I think in the ChatGPT era, maybe we're going to be emphasizing authentic learning. Maybe we're emphasizing process as much as product. Maybe we're thinking, what are rich assessment tasks that can really stimulate an interaction between the human and the non-human? So I feel that aspect of the framework synergizes well. Second element of the framework, evaluative expertise. Again, I think nice synergy with the ChatGPT era because students need to critically evaluate any inputs from ChatGPT. And then the third idea, principled feedback for uptake. Again, I see synergies because presumably with AI-generated inputs, we need to reflect on their validity, their reliability. Can we make sense of them? So optimistically, I see synergies between learning-oriented assessment and the new ChatGPT era. I think that's enough for me, but congratulations on the book, and I hope you have a fantastic book launch. Thank you.
Okay.
Some great thoughts there, huh?
I think so. Yeah, and David mentioned some of the principles that we laid out in the introductory chapter. We'll come back to those in a minute. But now let's see what Jim Purpura has to say about Lola. Just give me a second. Okay, and again, let me know if the sound works.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Papura, and Wang asked me to talk a little bit about what learning-oriented language assessment meant to me, and what it meant in the post-COVID era, and given the new advancements in AI technology. Before I do that, though, I'd like to congratulate Wang and Hayo for their book, Innovation in Learning-Oriented Language Assessment. It's really great to see that people around the world are interested in the interface between learning and assessment and teaching, and this is really great. Let me just start with the first question of what this means to me. Well, I've been working with learning-oriented assessment literally since the year 2000 when I was writing my Assessing Grammar book. I had a chapter in there that at the very end that just kind of dealt with, well, what are we doing with assessments in pedagogical contexts, and what does that have to do with learning? And so I started to think about assessment and learning as it related to the types of tasks we give and the sociocognitive processes that these tasks elicited, and what they actually meant for how people not only process information, but ultimately how they learn new things in the context of a language class at one point in time, and also over time. And so I've been working with that for a long time. But what does this mean to me now? A little bit later, I think I worked with Carolyn Turner, and we thought about, what does it mean in a classroom-based context to where learning and teaching and assessment all come together, and so we came up with a framework. This approach to learning-oriented assessment is different from some of the other approaches, but this approach basically identifies, with Carolyn Turner, 7 dimensions of what happens in any language use event. And after COVID, I also added in the technological piece. So basically, here's what it means to me. In any kind of language use event, and that could be in the context of a classroom, in the context of a test, the context maybe of a scenario-based test even. In real life, what really happens is that there's a context of what we're doing, and here's the context of what I'm doing right now. And in this context, I need to use language to be able to respond to the question. So the question was, can you tell me about what LOA means to you right now? And so for me, that's an assessment. That's assessment task, asking me that question. And I am then using my first language proficiency in order to be able to respond to that question. So, now we've got the contextual, the elicitation, and the performance, or the proficiency dimension. We've got 3 dimensions here. I needed to think about this in order to be able to answer the task. So there's obviously the sociocognitive piece where I processed the information in the task and drew on my own background knowledge in order to be able to respond to the task. So there's that dimension is really front and center. And I'm talking to a bunch of people, so I'm a little bit nervous here, even though I've done this a million times. I still have to manage that my affect. And so there's that affective dimension as well that always comes into play. And then there's I'm talking to an audience here, but I can't see you guys, but I know you're there. And so there is definitely a socio-interactional dimension that's being tapped into as well. And COVID made me really understand the role of technology and how technology can can really allow us to do things that we haven't done before, and it can also make us nuts as well. But that dimension is really front and center in what I'm doing today and what I do in class, what I do a lot in my work right now. The only dimension that right now isn't being tapped into, which would be tapped into in almost any kind of language use event, and that is the instructional dimension. When I talk to people in the street, when I see my colleagues, they always teach me something about themselves, and I'll hopefully teach them something about me or what I'm thinking about. So there's always that, that interface between instruction, teaching me something, and my processing it, and then teaching them something as well. So this is front and center in that framework. So for me, learning-oriented assessment based on the framework that Carolyn Turner and I came up with is really characterizes what we do in language use events, and it should characterize what we do in instruction, because those are trying to be proxies of that. And then also similarly in language assessments. So I hope that, I answered the question, Sin, well enough. And congratulations really on the new book that you guys came out with. Thank you very much.
Right. Yeah, I think two very good messages, very succinct summaries of two slightly different frameworks, but I think equally highly cited and referred to in different contexts. So but I think one of the messages that I got from their reflections is that learning-oriented assessment or learning-oriented language assessment, it's not a specific type of assessment. I think a lot of people think about learning-oriented assessment as formative assessment, but it's really not the case. So summative assessment can be learning-oriented if it's designed, enacted, and followed up, appropriately by centering or honing into the learning components. I think this is one of the key points that I got. It's not a specific type of assessment, but it's rather a design principle, or design principles when we look at language assessment. Hayo, I wonder if you have anything to add about, or your thoughts before we move on to the next part.
No, not at this point. I was really happy with the two reflections. I thought that was really nice of them to record that for us.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. So let me just share my screen again. Right. Okay. So we have looked at what participants think about LOLA. We have just listened to two experts and their reflections on what LOLA means for the current era. Now we would like to talk a little bit, just very briefly, about how we understand learning-oriented language assessment in the book. And in the introductory chapter, as David Carlos referred to one of the principles, Hayo and I set out 10 principles for implementing learning-oriented language assessment. So these principles are slightly different from the two frameworks that David and Jim talked about, because those are frameworks that focus on LOLA as a concept more, and these are principles focusing on enacting, implementing learning-oriented language assessment in the classroom. And I would say that we came up with these 10 principles based on all the chapters that we have in the book. So these 10 principles are not Hayo's, they are not mine. They're basically our synthesis of all the chapters, all the practical examples that we have in the book, and we come up with these 10 principles. This is what I would call a collective wisdom of some sort. So I'm going to very quickly read through those, and hopefully we have time to come back to these principles in the discussion. So the first principle is that teachers or language teachers, they need a renewed understanding or an expanded understanding of what language assessment means, especially in terms of its relationship with teaching and learning, because a lot of teachers see assessment as an add-on, as a baggage, as something different from teaching and learning. The second principle is that language assessment tasks need to be designed to represent language use in authentic communicative situations. David talked about the need for being authentic, authenticity. Jim talked about his contextual dimension. And I think that echoes what we're talking about here in the second principle. The third one is the opportunities that need to be provided to students to be more proactive in the feedback process. So I'm very glad that feedback came up as one of the principles, because feedback is such a core and essential mechanism that drives learning through assessment. So students should be able to kind of respond and engage with feedback more proactively. The next principle, I think this is James' chapter for sure. So the potential of gamification in language assessment can be explored to to maximize student engagement.
Yeah, I don't like the term gamification attached to my work, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. Gamification is behaviorist, behavior manipulation. I don't vibe with that word. Sorry.
Okay, all right. So I think what we're talking about here is the use of gaming elements or games in assessment design. And I think I see it in quite a lot of work, of course, not just in James's work, but other people's as well, looking at the impact that it has on motivation and engagement. So that's something to think about as well. The next principle is about assessment tasks, again, that students can be orientated towards more focused, purposeful, and deep self-reflections. I think the need for students to reflect on their own learning, and this is what David talked about in terms of evaluative expertise or evaluative judgment, thinking about the quality of their own work in relation to work by other people, for example, when they look at exemplars. The next principle, a community of practice approach, can be adopted by making students' work visible and accessible. So I think this is about demonstrating learning outcome and having that learning outcome visible to peers, of course, in a safe and kind of a supportive environment. The next principle is about autonomy, and I think this is about teacher autonomy. So teachers need to develop and exercise their autonomy, and I think autonomy doesn't mean absolute freedom, because we don't operate in absolute freedom, in developing appropriate assessment or feedback strategies. All right. The next one is the one that David said he really likes, and I think this is good that we talked about summative assessment here, is the learning aspect or the learning affordances of summative assessment and how it can be maximized when we design a test, for example, or an exam. Teachers can also explore the opportunity to personalize students' assessment experience by using technology, for example. And the next one, language assessment can be used to promote language learning autonomy. All right, so these are the 10 principles that you can find in our chapter. And again, as I said, it's a synergy of all the chapters that we have in the book. And of course, it's our interpretation of the chapters. Okay, so the next part is, again, a very exciting part to me, because I have invited 3 contributors who have agreed to share briefly their own chapters, their practices of learning-oriented language assessment in their own context. So I'm just putting this in the order of the chapter, and I think if that's okay, we'll follow this order. They will be speaking very briefly, 5 minutes to 10 minutes, about their chapter, what they think is important, what they think we should take away from their chapters. So we have Tony Berner here, who will be talking about formative language assessment research and what it means to practitioners. We also have Huahui here talking about self and teacher assessment using like co-constructed rubrics. And finally, we have Magnus here, who will be talking about, and I think this is very important, really interesting, it's about assessment literacy of teachers, not just students. So Tony, I wonder if do you mind if we start with you?
That's okay. Thank you. Thanks. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to talk, and it'd be good to see you all, actually. So if you can put your camera on, that would be nice. And you'll recognize many of the things that Purpura and Carlos talked about in what I'm talking about, and also the 10 principles. Many of them are relevant for this chapter. The chapter is on formative assessment. So as you know, it's not either formative or summative, but more or less formative or more or less summative. And my focus has been the research that has defined itself as being formative. So I wanted to look at what do we actually know. So a review, a short, small-scale study review of formative language assessment studies. The terms formative and summative, as some of you may know, derived from Scriven and 1960s program evaluations. But speaking of classroom assessment, it was more in the 1990s by the Assessment Reform Group in the UK that approach it from that perspective, and also coined the term assessment for learning, which many researchers use interchangeably for formative assessment, which include assessment types such as self-assessment, peer assessment, portfolio assessment, questions and answers in informal assessments, logs, formative feedback, etc., etc. All assessments that promote learning for students and for teachers. And the review by Black and William was influential and had a great impact on research going on around the world. Many studies cite that review study, which showed positive effects on learning, that formative assessment has positive effects on learning, also in language learning classrooms. But as far as I know, there have not been any like up-to-date review on language learning classrooms and formative assessments. So that's what I wanted to do. I use the keywords formative assessment and language in the two biggest corpora, ERIC and Scopus for education. I could have used other ones also, but it was limited to those two and limited to the last 5 years, 2016 to 2021. Limited also to only peer-reviewed articles and the ones that are only empirical. So I excluded theoretical articles and also the ones that were available in full text. So I got hundreds of hits when I did this, as you do when you start a review study. And I started tracking down the ones that are relevant for my research. So looking at all the titles of all these hundreds of studies and abstracts, reading those, and then ending up with like 50, 60 articles, and then again reading all of them, and ending up at the very end with 44 relevant articles that were like the most relevant ones for the purpose of this study. I categorized their findings into 3 main categories. One was nature of assessment, what type of assessment, like peer assessment, self-assessment, portfolio assessment. The second category was modes of assessment, like is it written, oral, multimodal. The third category was context of assessment. Where did the study, where was it conducted? Which country, which nation, which class level, which language subject, etc. So looking at that, we can say that the nature of assessment is, of course, formative feedback. A lot of studies, that is probably the subcategory that is most frequent. It's formative feedback, that there's studies that investigate how formative feedback influences students' learning. And formative language assessment, also using digital tools, various digital tools. Portfolio assessment is quite common as one type of assessment. And there were, apart from these, several other types of assessments, such as self-assessment. Quizzes were used a lot in language learning classrooms, quizzes, multiple drafting, peer assessment, oral presentations. Some studies included that, and a few ones on informal formative language assessment, which is like, basically the classroom interaction that goes on informally, and here students respond and teachers respond to that response. Most of the research, not surprisingly, was in a written mode. So we need more research on oral mode, multimodal modes. When it comes to contexts, there were from a range of countries: Norway, Turkey, Malaysia, the United States, the UK, China, Russia, Japan, just to mention some. Mostly the English subject, also not surprising, but mostly the English subject when it comes to languages was studied, but I also found studies on Spanish, Mandarin, Swedish, and French. When it comes to English, it is mostly English as a foreign language that is studied in formative language assessment studies, but I also found a few on English as second language and also other types of English, such as English for academic purposes. Also, higher education, when it comes to the level of education that is studied, dominates higher education. I've seen this before also in other studies I've done, that there is a lot on formative assessment when it comes, there's a lot in higher education. We need more studies from lower levels of education, particularly primary levels. I found some studies in secondary levels of education, but not so many from primary levels. There are a range of research methods that are used, with qualitative, mixed, quantitative. Few studies use pre and post research, which is quite interesting to see whether formative assessment actually has an impact on students' learning. They do some tests before, and they do interventions, and they do post studies. But most of these studies have a few participants. I found a couple of studies that have hundreds of participants. So what? Just finishing up within my the time allotted to me was maximum 10 minutes. I think I have 1 minute left or something. Teachers need to focus more on formative assessment. Both teachers and students, they prefer formative assessment, but they need to practice it. Students find formative assessment as enjoyable, authentic. They prefer mixed formative feedback, not only from the teacher or not only from peers, but mixed. Some prefer one-to-one oral feedback more than other types of feedback. Students, of course, prefer praise more than, and it is shown through studies that praise is more effective than punishment when it comes to feedback. Negative feedback in some cultures, particularly Southeast Asian cultures, may lead to the risk of losing face for the students. Portfolio assessment is very much recommended because it involves multiple drafting, learner-centeredness. There is like formative assessment implicit and included in many of the activities you do in portfolio assessment. When it comes to self-assessment, students are unable to benefit from it unless teachers provide necessary language guidance. It is very important to underline that. E-learning tools that have become quite frequent in language assessments are quite effective and a positive effect on learning, also in pre and post studies. All in all, formative assessment in language learning classrooms seems to be more effective than other types of assessments. Not only written skills, but also on listening, speaking, critical skills, language awareness, and self-regulation. Also, finally, teachers that are part of professional development programs, they show stronger beliefs in formative language assessments than the ones that are not part of any professional development programs. That's it, folks. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks. That's very, very helpful. I always find it very challenging to summarize a research synthesis in a few minutes because there's just so much information in there. I think you did a wonderful job. Thank you. One point that Tony talked about is how we can support students before we let them self-assess or peer assess. And I think one example of that support is to kind of help students co-construct their rubrics that they're going to use in writing assessment, for example. So I think our next speaker, Hui, is going to talk about something like that. So I'll hand it over to Hui.
Thanks, Wang. I'll share my screen. It's my first time share screen in Zoom. Hope it works. Does it work?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'll talk about chapter 6, which I wrote with one of my colleagues to explore the consistency between self-assessment and the teacher assessment. So we use a co-constructed assessment descriptors. I won't talk too much about theoretical background because I think all of you know it really well. So two things I would like to point out is one, when I was asked in the survey, what is learning-oriented language assessment, the first word come to my mind, or first two words come to my mind is learner agency. And in our paper, we discussed how learner agency could be facilitated or hindered by embedded social context. And the research context we carried out is a teacher-driven learning context. In that context, the teachers are the only assessment agency, but we would like to improve the learner agency in the learning, but to persuade learner students to use it, we need to provide empirical evidence of how reliable self-assessment is, where are the differences, and how we can enhance it. So the existing study showed inconsistency findings across different instructional settings, and which might be affected by the assessment focuses, by the use or the design of assessment criteria, and also the instructions provided to the students, including the training in use assessment. So this project was funded by British Council to look at how the CEFR's Common European Framework can be used in different contexts. When we carried out the project, it was the time the Chinese government tried to introduce the new assessment criteria called China Standards of English Language Ability in order to bridge teaching, learning, assessment, and to develop learner autonomy. Before we introduced the self-assessment into a context, the student received really little formative feedback because of the large class size. And in the feedback, there's very limited information about strengths, limitations, and how to improve those weaknesses. So we think it's really important, and as mentioned by David and James, about the alignment between assessment, teaching, and learning. So we had a lot of meetings to review the syllabus, to review the teaching context. We have discussion about the learners' language proficiency and their motivation, because only we can read their motivation, they can engage in self-assessment. We also talk a lot about the students' daily life, so how we can design the assessment criteria or descriptor, which actually become part of their daily reflection. So we spend lots of time to try to build the constructed alignment between assessment, teaching, learning, but not only teaching, learning, but also about teachers as an agency and learners as one of the whole person in that classroom. We discussed all this actually in another journal article. One of the main things we decide to use is use emoticons rather than numbers to encourage self-assessment for various reasons. So this is briefly how it looks like. The self-assessment grade, it is a bilingual version based on students' feedback. On the first version, we only have the English version, and the students they really struggled to understand the descriptor and to use it in their assessment. And the same assessment grade was used by the teachers while we change I can to can statements. We asked two research questions in that book chapter. One is, what was the inter-reader agreement between self-assessment and teacher assessment using the co-constructed assessment criteria? And what are the differences between self and teacher assessment ratings? We have two EAP tutors who have different learning teaching experience in that program. We have 146 students from 4 classes, from, as you can see from the table, from 3 subjects. Their language proficiency is rather similar, unless apart from the one from public management program, their final writing marks are slightly higher. So we collected data from 2 genres. One is summary, and the other is argumentative essay. We allocated 30 minutes for students to carry out a self-assessment after the really rigorous training of how to use assessment descriptors in assessment. We asked students to tick one of the 3 options, as I showed in the previous slide, the 3 emoticons standing for 3 different levels of their assessments. And the teacher used the same assessment criteria to assess the same essays without reading student self-ratings, because that might affect their rating. So it is quite a quantitative oriented. So we use kappa agreement, try to look at the assessment agreement between teacher and student rating results. We then use Wilcoxon signed rank test to try to find out where is inconsistency. So what are the key findings? Firstly, we found students seems to have significant differences in terms of the ratings. The most of the for significant more assignments received higher rating from teachers than the students themselves. Most of the assessment focuses. Half the students, or over half the students in some cases, shared a similar understanding of their proficiency in those assessment aspects. But the congruence between self and teacher rating varied from tasks and from the assessment descriptors. We discussed the key implications for practitioners. One, the practitioner and maybe even the student needed to be aware of the fact that self-assessment results differ from focuses of assessment. It seems like we have achieved a much higher level of consistency between teacher and student or self-assessment in macro than micro assessments. And you can find what macro assessment and micro assessment aspects is in the book chapter. So based on that, we, as writing tutors, need to provide more explicit explanations of descriptor regarding the micro aspect of writing, mainly refer to the different aspects of language use. Some of the suggestions including demonstrating how teachers assess those aspects with the assessment descriptor, developing student assessment literacy regarding how they can assess themselves in those aspects, increasing reflection time. If the class time is really constrained, for instance, on 10 or 20 minutes, then we needed to reduce assessment descriptor. Maybe 5 assessment descriptor would be fine, but we need to provide students with enough reflection time, what they have achieved or have not achieved. Teachers need to use self-assessment more selectively. We need to shift from the current misconception like self-assessment as a one-size-fits-all assessment tool. We also need to accommodate self-assessment with really careful assessment design in terms of, for instance, why we want to use self-assessment, when we should use it and how we can use it, and most importantly, involve students in the decision-making process. We also need to foster a culture of self-assessment in classroom settings. Like James mentioned, is affective aspect. It's really important. So we need to develop students and tutors' affective and behavioral system, which can facilitate the use of self-assessment in the classroom context, especially in the teaching-driven instructional context. This is a slide I shared with my students all the time. And they ask me why it's important to involve students. And I said, okay, so let's look at this. And how do you think? So tell me, and I forget, teach me, and I may remember. but involve me, I learn. Okay, so this is about chapter 6.
Thank you. Thank you, Huawei. Thanks very much. A very neat
Thank you so
summary.
much. That's great.
Yeah. Thanks. And I
No
think,
worry.
yeah, I think that's the last slide is spot on. I mean, we need to involve students, but of course, the more important question is how do we prepare students to be involved in a meaningful way, right? So I think, you know, what you mentioned about how to scaffold students, how to prepare students to engage meaningfully in self-assessment is important. It's more than just giving them a piece of paper and say, write down what you think you've done well, what you think you can improve on. And you also mentioned, Hayo, on the need for developing students' assessment literacy. I think that's also very important. I think not only students, right, teachers as well, need to develop their assessment literacy if they were to kind of understand what assessment really means in relation to teaching and learning. And I think that's precisely what Magnus' chapter is about. It's about pre-surface English teachers' assessment literacy, right, Magnus?
More or less, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Very nice segue there.
I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Wang, and thanks for having me, everyone. So yeah, as Wang said, my chapter is focusing on the development of learning-oriented language assessment literacy in pre-service language teachers. So if we want, we can invent a new acronym, LOLAL, if it doesn't already exist, have a world premiere. It seemed a bit clunky to me, so I didn't use it myself, but perhaps it already exists. So if I just talk briefly about me, just to kind of illustrate the background to this study. So I worked for quite a long time as a language teacher educator, mainly on CELTA courses, but also in other contexts. So for those of you who don't know what the CELTA is, it's a short training course for people to become language teachers, primarily in private language schools, mainly to adults, but they can also teach in other contexts as well, depending on the country they're in and the institution. And I currently work for Cambridge University Press and Assessment. So then I have this kind of interest in language assessment as well. So this focus on the assessment literacy of teachers and how to develop it was kind of a natural progression from there. I just want to add, this is an independent study that I did just for fun. It's not a Cambridge University study by any means. And beyond these personal interests, there's the existing research I'm sure you're familiar with. So there's various studies measuring the language assessment literacy of different stakeholders, so teachers, university admissions officers, people like that. But there's not so much on the assessment literacy, first of all, of the language teacher educators, so the people who train these new language teachers. I think there's one from Latin America, is it Villas Lorena? She found that, yeah, language teacher educators generally hadn't had a lot of language assessment training themselves. And so this obviously impacts on potentially the assessment literacy of language teachers being trained by these people. And then additionally, the development of language assessment literacy, there's not a lot of information out there, at least at the time of writing. So there's a few studies on the development of general assessment literacy, but not so much on developing language assessment literacy. So all this kind of formed the background for the focus of this study, which was, yeah, as I said, the language assessment literacy of the CELTA tutors, so the people training teachers on these short pre-service courses. Then which assessment topics are encountered on CELTA courses, specifically in input sessions, which is like the workshop component, where the training teachers have a little lesson with the tutor on various topics related to language teaching. Which assessment topics do CELTA tutors think are important for language teachers? And in all three of those cases, I was also interested in the difference between LOA topics and kind of non-LOA assessment topics. And finally, I was interested in what types of activities are used on CELTA courses to develop LOAL. So quite a wide range of research questions. It became a little bit sprawling, but yeah, it was all quite interesting to me. So the method, I used a survey. So basically I constructed a list of assessment topics divided into LOA topics and non-LOA topics, mainly based, I started with a survey that Kreml and Harding developed to measure assessment literacy. And then I added in some other elements from David Carlos, Glenn Fulcher, Liz Hamplyons. So I ended up with a list of, I think I had 9 LOA topics and 9 non-LOA topics. So quite a nice way to compare them. And then I shared this survey on a Facebook group for CELTA tutors, and I had 64 responses. So there's about, we're not quite sure, we think there's about 1,000 tutors active around the world, so that's a decent sample size, I think. And then with these survey results, so that they're primarily like at scale questions. So for each research question, there was a list of topics, and it was, which one, how confident do you feel in this? How important do you think this is for teachers? How often do you kind of deliver this topic in your CELTA courses? And then I used rational analysis to analyze the results. So this was quite new for me. It's something I'd learned about in my role here at Cambridge. So it's kind of also a developmental thing for me personally to use this method, but it's quite a nice way to kind of get an objective view of survey data from subjective questions, like how confident are you, how often do you, that kind of thing. And it helps me get kind of a ranking of topics in these different areas. Excuse me. So the first research question was about the kind of the self-reported assessment literacy of the language teacher educators. And so we saw that they generally felt confident in most topics. They felt all the LOA topics they seemed to have confidence in. The two outliers where they didn't feel confident were determining cut scores and determining alignment of an assessment with a local context. Everything else they generally felt quite confident in. And there was, more of the LOA topics were higher up and more of the non-LOA topics were lower down. This was similar for the second question, which was what were the most common assessment topics in the CELTA input sessions? So again, LOA related topics tended to be encountered more frequently on CELTA courses, and non-LOA topics less frequently. Again, with those same two right at the bottom. So the cut scores and alignment to local contexts. The third research question, so that was the importance, how they viewed different assessment topics, how important they were for CELTA trainees. And as before, the LOA topics tended to be viewed as more important than the non-LOA topics. Again, with those same two non-LOA topics right at the bottom, outliers. I didn't do slides because there's like 18 topics and 3 questions. It'd be quite a lot to look at. Something for you to enjoy in the book. The fourth research question is that was about the activity types they used to develop these different areas. So the most common activity type used was assessing a piece of student work. And from my personal experience, I can see that's quite common. Often it'll be like some student writing, and you might use a correction code to mark it and things like that. Analysing existing assessments, discussing their own experiences. Experiencing being assessed was quite a common one. So that you'll see a lot of CELTA courses where the trainees are given a test to complete to kind of experience what it's like for the students. And then the least common activity types were sharing research findings and using apps or websites or other pieces of technology related to assessment. And then I also looked at, for each assessment, for each LOA topic, what the most and least common activity types were. So the LOA topic, which was most commonly encountered on CELTA courses, was how to use assessments to inform learning or teaching goals. So that's the one that most tutors had activities for. And most of them use assessing a piece of student work, which makes sense. And the least common one was analysing an existing assessment, which probably makes sense. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be more common, but perhaps if it would be useful, maybe if teachers are expected to use a certain assessment in their own context, it might be useful for them to think about how they might analyse that assessment so that they can use it to inform their own learning or teaching goals. And then, yeah, as you'd expect, sharing research findings and using technology was the least common activity type for most of these topics. And in general, every activity type was used at least once by a tutor for every LOA topic, apart from those two, sharing research findings. And it's just sharing research findings was not used by anyone for the topic of scaffolding and questioning, which kind of surprised me. I think there is research out there on the value of questioning or feedback, that sort of thing. So a very quick run through there. So just some of the general conclusions that you won't necessarily have heard from me, but you would see if you read the article, because as I said, it's quite detailed. So in general, most LOA topics are commonly encountered on CELTA courses, and they're seen as important for trainees, and tutors feel confident in them, in their own assessment, literally in these areas. One area that would benefit from perhaps a bit more focus is how assessment can influence materials and course design. This was consistently kind of the lowest ranked LOA topic in tutor assessment literacy, in importance for trainees, and in how often it's encountered in CELTA courses. And of course, I'm sure we all know that it is quite an important part of LOA, is using assessment for this valuable effect in influencing materials and course design. So perhaps there's ways in which we can support teachers further there. Another area which was quite low was understanding the purpose of assessment. So you could also call that assessment principles. That can also be from another study I was involved in. I can also say that's as simple as calling it assessment rather than calling it testing. Seems to have an effect on a lot of tutors and a lot of teachers, considering it in a kind of a wider perspective. They use lots of resources, as we saw, but as we said, sharing research findings probably would be a good one to look at more. I'm sure I don't need to convince this audience of that. Then it's ensuring the training is kind of up to date, and when they're reflecting on their own teaching, they kind of have an idea of what works, what doesn't work. And also a bit more on assessment related software or technology. Again, that's reflecting the current changes that we're seeing in assessment nowadays. So with Duolingo, with Cambridge English Write and Improve, it'd be good for teachers to have more awareness of that, I think. And then this idea that, so determining the alignment to local context, as I said, that was the lowest ranking, one of the two lowest ranking items in all areas. But previous findings on teacher LAL suggest that it might be worth focusing on this anyway. And you can imagine teachers do a CELTA in one context and they might teach in another context. It would be useful for them to think about how the assessments they use work in their local context. And then we got some nice suggestions from users as well about different activities you could use. So as I said, tests on testing. Sometimes the questions in these tests, the trainees do a design so that they can consider reliability and validity. So they'll kind of get very inappropriate questions or inappropriate scoring rubrics to get them to reflect on those. There's nice example, there's a peer assessment activity that trainees did on intellectual competence. So the trainees had to give each other feedback on their intellectual competence in a speaking task with a partner, and that was a nice way of combining three areas of LOA, so feedback, scaffolding, and peer and self-assessment. And then other innovative approaches like using video clips from YouTube. So CELTA courses can be really intensive, so trainers often like to mix it up a bit. And there's a nice clip from Monty Python's Life of Brian, where there's a character giving feedback to another, which you can use quite effectively to consider principles for effective feedback. Limitations, so it would have been good to have more qualitative data, so seeing how the respondents interpreted the assessment topics. For example, one of the topics was writing language assessment tasks. They might have thought this related purely to formal test items rather than including language skills practice tasks as used in the classroom. And also this idea that assessment is just an area based on testing. This might be quite a common interpretation as well. So that's an area for future research. But yeah, there's some interesting findings there. And yeah, I think CELTA is generally a very interesting area to research because you've got this kind of global context and lots of experienced teacher educators having a lot of freedom to take these innovative approaches within the general framework of the CELTA course imposed by Cambridge. I think that's everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Magnus. I think that's an important area of research, looking at, teacher professional development and assessment or initial teacher education. So that's very interesting. Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time. So unfortunately, I don't think we will have time for discussion, but I wonder if anyone has any last comment. Okay, so if not, I just want to pop 2 links and then we'll call it a day in the chat. So the first link is the link to our book. And so if your university has subscription to Springer, you should be able to access the book. And the other link that I will put in there is just a plug for the book series. So this book, Innovation in Language Learning-Oriented Language Assessment, is part of the book series that Hayo edits, New Language Learning and Teaching Environments. So I think it's an excellent series. It has a great collection of publications there on innovative topics, really practical topics. I'm not sure whether Hayo you would like to say something about it, but I thoroughly enjoy the whole experience and quite proud to be part of that series.
Yeah, thanks, Xin Wang, and thanks for the plug. And if any of you here at the moment or watching this video later, if you have a book that you're working on, have a look at the series, because new language learning and teaching environments, it's obviously fairly broad, but we're really trying to focus on kind of shifting ideas, innovative ideas, etc. So if there's any projects that you're working on and looking for a potential home for a book, if you have an idea, by all means, just contact me informally to run your idea past me, because always looking for good contributions. But yeah, just again want to thank Xin Wang for doing all this, all the preparatory work, and everybody for joining us for the launch.
Thank you. Nice to see everybody. Have a nice day. Cheers. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Take care.